Welcome everyone
This
tonight.
meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so all things assessment this evening. Assessment is something that I don't like, was one of those things, you know, they say you don't know what you don't know. I had no idea how little I knew about assessment until I started learning more intentionally about assessment, and found actually that I was then able to make like way better decisions about how I worked, and then also how much workload that generated, but how much more useful assessment was as a result of just understanding assessment theory a bit more. So I'm really hoping that this evening will be useful to you in terms of just getting to grips with assessment theory, understanding what effective practice looks like around assessment, and how you can actually use that to benefit your schools, benefit your pupils, but also benefit you as a teacher in terms of workload and choosing to do activities that are really worthwhile. There's quite a lot to fit in, so I have tried to include opportunities for some breakout rooms and some reflection, but if I'm kind of going too fast, let me know, or if you need me to explain anything in a bit more detail, because we have got next week left in the course, which is our final week, where I'll be focusing on quality assurance. But if we can't get through the things this week that we need to, we can come back to it next week, because obviously quality assurance and assessment are interrelated quite closely anyway. So the areas we will cover tonight is, we'll start off looking at some assessment theory. I'll go through some key terms with you and their meanings, and then we'll specifically look at some tools around summative assessment and formative assessment. So on page 2 of your workbooks, you have got a list of terms in a table, and the table has one side blank, which is just so that you can think about and process and jot down in your own words your understanding of these terms as we go through them. So you can do that in a fairly fluid way as we go through. If you think, oh, what she just said is really useful, I'll just make a note of that. But I will also prompt you at key points to kind of have a think about, we've just covered, for example, validity. Have a think about what that means to you and make a note of that in your booklets. And these are terms that I'm using because they're really useful then in thinking about effective assessment, and really building that into your curriculum planning, so that assessment serves the curriculum rather than being something that dictates the curriculum to you. So thinking about assessment then, basically when we assess pupils, we're trying to find stuff out about them. We're trying to make inferences about how much they know, or what it is that they can do with what they know. So to kind of illustrate how assessment practice can work effectively, but also some of the pitfalls we can fall into, we're going to think about something different, which is how pollsters predict the outcomes of elections and referenda. So if I am a pollster and I'm trying to anticipate how the entire population will vote, as a polling agency, I would ask a small number of people, a sample of the population, how they intend to vote. Because if I asked everyone in the population, well, that's the vote. Like, I'm not going to be able to do that. There's no point having the vote. That is just the vote. So I just need to pick a sample of the population and ask them. So if you imagine my screen, I'm presuming you can see a black screen. Imagine that black screen represents the entire population of a country. And this little white dot is the sample that I select. And I say to that sample, how are you planning to vote in this election? And then from there, I work out what I think the entire population will vote like. So if 72% of the people I ask say they're going to vote for the Green Party, say, I'm going to make an inference, therefore, that 72% of the entire population will vote in that particular way. Now, the thing is, I won't just ask one sample. I'll probably pick a few samples from different areas of the population, and we'll look at how important that is in a bit more detail in a while. For your reference, this is exactly the same way to how viewing figures for television programme is worked out. They ask a small sample of viewers what they were watching, and from there they scale it up to the size of the population to get an idea of the numbers of people that were watching EastEnders on Tuesday night. However, pollsters can sample really badly. So if we imagine again, we've got the entire population represented by this black screen. If I pick my sample from one particular area, and it's all clustered together. So that could be a geographical area, a particular part of the country that I go to, and I only ask a sample of people from that part of the country, or it might be a particular demographic of society. If I only ask professional people working above a certain income level, I'm only going to get the opinions of that small section of society, and the result will then be skewed that I get. It will no longer be representative of the entire population, but just of that little section that I've picked. So there's a risk then that my prediction will be completely incorrect. For example, as we saw with the EU referendum, where the pollsters got it completely wrong. So what I just mentioned was one of the reasons that pollsters sometimes get the results wrong. The inferences they make are incorrect. So if I kind of show you how people voted in different parts of the country, if I only sampled from London, when I asked my sample how they would vote in the Brexit referendum, I'm going to be fairly confident that the vote will be Remain. And I'm going to apply that to the rest of the country, only to discover that outside of London, largely people voted Leave. So that's one way that the result can be really inaccurate in predicting what would happen. The other thing that can really influence how people respond when you're sampling is how the question is asked. So in an experiment that was done, some researchers asked people, what's the average number of days each week that you eat butter? And when they asked that question, 23% of people said 7 days a week. So 23% of people said 7 days a week, I eat butter. Then when they rephrased the question, the next question is about butter, not including margarine. What is the average number of days a week that you eat butter? That percentage dropped to 9%. So the way the questions are worded can also influence the quality of the sampling and of the answers you get, and therefore the conclusions that you can reach. And then the third thing can be around participant motivation. So when you are sampling and you're asking a sample of the population how they feel about something, or what they know, or what they understand about something, or what they do, you are relying on them answering honestly, and you're relying on them answering at all. So if somebody, for whatever reason, didn't feel they wanted to be honest in giving you their answer, again, you're going to make a judgment that is based on incorrect data. So just to summarize this bit, in terms of polling, and I'll bring this back to assessment in a moment, both what we choose to sample, so which portions of the whole population we sample is really important, but also how we choose to ask and the context that we ask in will all affect the quality and the accuracy of the judgments that we then go on to make. So assessment of pupil learning follows that same principle. The black screen now represents the domain, and the domain is everything you've taught pupils, everything you want them to master, or everything you want them to do. That is the entire domain. And when we assess, we are very unlikely to be able to assess that entire domain. There may be some situations very early on in pupils' education. So I'm thinking kind of around very specific assessment of things like phonics when pupils are at early stages of decoding, where you are in the luxurious position of being able to actually assess every single bit of knowledge. But by the time pupils move through school, that domain is so massive and so vast that it's very unlikely that you would be able to assess all of it. So we do exactly the same thing. We assess a sample. So we follow the same principles, and we should be sampling from across the domain. And from there, we can hopefully make some inferences about how much it is that pupils have learned. I just want to pause for a moment because everybody's gone blank. I just want to check that I'm not frozen. Can somebody unmute and let me know if you're still there? Because it looks very frozen.
I can hear you.
I'm here.
Okay, cool. Thank you. I just wanted to check because it had all gone very dark on my screen. Right, I'll carry on then. So sorry, we sample from the domain, and from there we try to make inferences about how much of that domain pupils have learned. So if in our sample pupils can demonstrate that they know 50% of the content that we wanted them to learn, we can then make an inference that they have learned 50% of the entire domain. But it's only an inference. So the same things apply as with the poll. If we sample badly, if we sample from maybe just one section of the domain and we ignore the rest of the domain, we may get a skewed result, particularly if the part of the domain that we sample from is more or less challenging than other sections of the domain. So we need to be really careful when we pick that sample, when we decide what it is we want to assess, to make sure that it's a broad sample and that it helps us make more accurate inferences. But we also need to think about the way that we ask questions and the context that we ask those questions in exactly the same way that pollsters do. So if we were to take a lesson from those pollsters, we have to accept, like, there is no way getting around it, that what we learn from assessments is limited. So we cannot know for sure what pupils have learned, and we cannot know for sure what they can definitely do. We can take action to try and make those inferences as reliable as possible, but we will not reach 100% reliability. Even if we've got a really well-designed test that samples really well, there are still aspects of the domain that we're not asking pupils about, because we won't have time to ask pupils about every single thing they've ever learned with us. And equally, pupils are unlikely to be able to, just because a pupil gets an answer right on one test that's drawn on a particular part of the domain, even that part of the domain, if you asked a different question in a different way on a different day, that you're not guaranteed that they would also get that answer right too. So we can never be 100% accurate with our inferences. And I think that's just a really important thing to recognize, is that what you know is limited. So yes, we want to use assessment effectively, and yes, we want to make sure that it's as helpful as possible, but it's really important to know that they are only ever inferences, and we're only ever improving the reliability of those, but we won't reach 100% reliability. So here are just kind of some things to think about in terms of what we are trying to obtain through assessment. I'll give you a moment just to read and absorb those. And just on this final bullet point, when we make summative inferences, so here we're talking about, for example, a GCSE exam, that's a summative inference. That grade that we give pupils represents something about their achievement across the domain. We're not at that point interested in how students performed on individual items. So I'm going to give you a moment here, if you wish to just make a note in your booklet on some of that key language around domain and sample. So I'll just give you 30 seconds or so to jot down in your own words any thoughts you've got about capturing the meaning of those two terms. Okay, so also in your booklet, just underneath where you've got that table, there are these questions, and these are really useful questions to consider when writing assessments. Again, I'll just give you a moment to have a glance. And some of these things we'll talk about a little bit more later. So for example, around distractors in multiple choice questions. Other things just at this point to draw your attention to, have students been taught to the sample or the domain? So this is a real risk when we as teachers know what's going to be assessed. So if we have got some internal assessments that we're doing, that we know what the questions are pupils will be asked, it's really, really difficult not to skew your teaching a little bit to that sample. And that is no criticism whatsoever of you as teachers. Like, it's not saying that you're cheating, it's just that you have that in your mind, and it's really hard not to kind of be hyper aware when you approach those topics. So when I was in the English department at Bedford Free School, I used to write the Key Stage 3 assessments, and they weren't shared with any other teachers. The reason was that we didn't want it to influence any other teachers' teaching of the domain. We really wanted to make sure that they didn't know what the sample was. But it was still really compromising for me, because I was so aware of what the sample was that, you know, even coming at it trying not to cheat and not to kind of emphasize, you're at risk of de-emphasizing for your pupils this part of the topic, because you don't want to give them any clues or give away that this might be on the paper, or focus a little bit more on it. So it's almost impossible to avoid knowledge of the sample influencing the way we teach, but at least being conscious of that is something that you can think about. And especially if you are planning a curriculum and an assessment model to go with it, for your summative assessments, where you're really trying to make inferences about how much pupils have mastered of that domain, be really thoughtful about changing the sample regularly, because it is just so easy to slip into focusing a little bit more year by year and teaching those aspects of the paper really well. And this was the situation in America. Actually, they did something where they would test the how well, like the time that it took for post to be delivered, and somehow the postal workers, so what they did was they sampled from a set number of addresses to see how long it took for their mail to get to them. And the postal workers became aware of what addresses were sampled, and so the postal workers were really diligent about making sure that any mail to those addresses was processed really promptly. You know, it's just natural when you're human to want to demonstrate what a good job you're doing, and sometimes it can influence to do things that actually get in the way of what we're trying to achieve, which is to work out, is the whole system working? Are we teaching this whole topic well, not just the little bit that comes up on the exam? You might want to as well just think about these questions and just have a think about whether there are any on there that you think you can particularly learn from. So are there any there that you kind of think, actually, we've never really thought about that. We've not thought about how we word items might confuse pupils or help pupils. You know, you want your pupils to be able to show what they know. So wording items in a way that is as clear for them as possible is a really worthwhile thing to do. Especially where you have pupils with additional barriers to learning. So, you know, I'm thinking specifically around SEN pupils. If questions are worded in a way that makes it really hard for them to understand, or if you've got pupils with literacy levels which makes it hard for them to understand, then make sure that your questions are as clear as possible so that they can demonstrate what they do know and what they can do, rather than being confused by obscure questioning. So we're going to go through a little example now of an assessment, and we're going to think about how we can draw conclusions that are helpful. And we're going to do a vocabulary test. So you might have seen that there's a copy of this in your booklet. So let's imagine that you're my class and I want to assess you as a group, and I want to know what the breadth of your vocabulary is. So first of all, in your booklets, you should have a table with these 3 words in on page 3. And I would like you to please write the definitions of these words down on page 3 of your workbooks. I will give you 30 seconds now. Okay, I am now going to put up the actual definitions of those words, and I would like you just to check your work and give yourself a mark for each word you defined correctly. Don't worry about the exact definition. If you think, yeah, I was about right there, give yourself a mark. So hopefully you should have a mark out of 3. Could you now tell me what your mark out of 3 was via the chat? So just type in 0, 1, 2 or 3 in the chat and hit return. Okay, I've got one answer, waiting for everyone else's answers. Oh, my chat's disappeared. I don't know if my computer's on the blink tonight.
I think maybe it's
oh, there we
delayed.
go. Okay, right. So I've got a few scores there looking like 0 or 1. Nice work, Andrew. Okay, I'm going to give you another vocabulary test now. It's test 2 in your books again. If you could make a note in there of your definition of each of those words. And for reference, the first word does not mean the place. Okay, and I'm going to put the answers up. So again, it doesn't have to be the precise definition, but have a look and give yourself a mark out of 3, and then pop that mark out of 3 in the chat, please. Okay, fabulous. Well, that's good news. You all just like improved massively in your vocabulary. So congratulations. You thought you were coming to a thing about assessment, but I've managed to make you like have a much better vocabulary. But clearly I haven't done anything to improve your vocabulary. So from the list that you had, obviously list 1 was way more challenging and obscure words, very subject specific words to define. Whereas test B just had everyday words in it that you're very likely to be able to define. So if we were to compare 2 cohorts that had words drawn from different lists and make inferences about which group has got a better grasp of vocabulary, I can't make any valid inferences about that. I can't make any valid inferences comparing those groups because it looks on paper as if one group knows what has a much better vocabulary than the others, whereas in reality, we know that that wouldn't be the case from that test. However, had both groups been asked to define the words from list 3, which are words that are not high frequency words, they're not kind of your everyday language, but would probably fall into kind of tier 2 vocabulary, so not specialist language that belongs to a subject, but language that you might get in a range of contexts, but fairly formal academic language, we're much more likely to make valid inferences. And this is the concept in assessing of validity. The validity of a test refers to how justified we can be in drawing conclusions from our sample. In the test we just did, I wouldn't be able to draw any valid conclusions. If I were to conclude that people lacked vocabulary in group 1 and put you into a special intervention group to help you with your vocabulary, thinking it would improve your writing, I would be absolutely wasting school resources, wasting your time as pupils, because I'm basing that intervention on a very poor set of data. Whereas actually I might kind of assume that the people in group 2 are my like real high flyers and not do anything to support them at all, and actually it may well be that they need more help with their vocabulary. So just to give you a moment now to just, if you haven't done it already, go back to the table in your booklets and in your own words, just make a note for yourself of what we're talking about when we talk about validity when it comes to assessment. And validity really matters when we design how we test pupils, because we need to think about what is the domain that we're trying to measure, and not just what we want to sample, but how the test should sample that domain. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more later on when we talk about different models of assessment and making sure that we select the right one for our subject area. So the other piece of language that we really need to understand in terms of assessment is the reliability of assessments. And reliability relates to the idea that it's like having an accurate set of scales. If a pupil were to take different versions of the same test, they would get approximately the same mark. So you're hoping that if different pupils took a GCSE exam one year and another year, you want those results to be comparable across years. And if any of you use things like the new group reading tests in schools, you know, those tests, their vocabulary tests, for example, have different words in. So the children actually sit different tests. But the idea is that they're reliably, like the sample is chosen so that those tests can be reliable in giving you, if a child sat another test, they should get approximately the same mark. Another aspect of reliability is if a child were to take the test at a different time or on a different day, they should get approximately the same mark. Or if 10 different people marked that paper, they should get approximately the same mark. So you're probably picking up from this how this is where there are a lot of sources of unreliability. So reliability is an aspect of how valid a test is, and it's asking about how consistent are the outcomes, how consistent are the scores that we get. And that can be impacted by a number of factors. One of them is the sample. So as I said before, if you pick a particular sample from the domain, and it's a really challenging sample, you might find that pupils get a much lower score than the pupils that had a sample from an easier part of the domain. The marker, different markers. Like I for years marked English papers, and like that you sit around a table and you never come up with the same mark, or very, very rarely. So there's real difficulty for markers in being consistent across different markers, but even across time. You may well have experienced, especially if you're marking something quite complex, extended writing or a performance. It's really hard to think, actually, am I still being consistent with the mark I gave at 9 o'clock this morning when I started this, when it's kind of, well, as an exam marker, it's 11:30 at night. I've got a full day of teaching tomorrow and I really want to get to bed, but I've got to get through these 6 papers before the morning. Like, are you still being consistent in your judgments by that time? And the student performance may vary by day. It can be impacted in the time of day that pupils take an exam. It can be impacted by hunger, by illness. You know, we have exam season at peak, hay fever season, for example. Pupils that if they're sitting one exam in an afternoon when they've had a very long afternoon in the morning, all of those things will impact on their performance day by day, which means that the outcome is not going to be completely reliable. And again, it's really difficult to mitigate for this, and we can't reduce a lot of these factors. They are part of the assessment system that we need to understand and do what we can to reduce, but can't eliminate completely. So just a reminder there of those key terms to give you a moment to think about reliability and make a note in your workbooks. And also just to point out, a test can be really reliable. So if your scales are broken and they tell you that you weigh 3 stone less than you do, and you stand on them every day, they're going to give you a really reliable reading, but that reading still isn't valid. So tests can be reliable, but still not valid, which we'll talk about a bit more later. So I'm going to get into some of the detail now, drawing on these terms and this understanding to help us think about summative assessment and what we can do around the ideas of making tests as valid as they can be, or just some of the decisions that we need to go through in considering the validity of tests, and also how we can work towards improving the reliability of assessment. So in terms of summative assessment, Our summative assessments are there to ensure that students are mastering an ever-growing domain as they work through it. So as I said earlier, it's very unlikely that we can test the entire domain for most things that we teach. And because pupils are learning more year on year and year, we really want to make sure that our summative assessments sample from all of the teaching that pupils have had over time. So if you think about sampling from a section of the domain, if we only ever sample what we've just finished teaching in terms of our summative assessments, we're going to get a skewed result potentially, because we're not actually sampling from the entire domain. So this image is like a Key Stage 3 model. Obviously, you could change the year groups to look at different key stages or different parts of pupils' education, but it's to give that sense of how you can set up an assessment model, which means that you are continuing to draw back on pupil understanding. So obviously, let's say year 7 in the autumn term is blue, and you're going to sample from that domain. But then in year 9, you're still going to be thinking about what was really important that they learned in year 7, and just checking in and sampling from that part of this entire domain that they've covered by year 9, to make sure that they're secure on that knowledge and that they've got those strong foundations for their future learning, rather than just focusing on an end of year assessment that assesses what they did in the summer term of year 9. But it's really, really important that you don't see that as an arbitrary job. So for a start, you don't want your year 9 assessment to be like 3 days long, because you're trying to pull so much information into it. But you also don't just want to pick random questions from previous years. You want to be really thoughtful about what aspects of the domain you wish to sample, and what you want to assess over time. So the questions in this box here can be really helpful. So thinking about your curriculum maps, what have you already identified as the core knowledge that is really foundational to pupil learning? That's worth assessing time and time again to check that pupils are secure with it. And I do think there's an element of, if pupils know that work is going to be assessed year after year, they can build it into their revision practices, and you can build it into your retrieval within lessons. What do you need from the short-term teaching? What's really important from what you've just taught for later? So maybe you'd be tempted to sample hugely from the recent content, which might be the right thing to do, but do think about what's really crucial about that content as well, and what's really important to them later in their lives. So particularly by the end of year 9, in a lot of subjects, pupils won't be progressing with that later on. But there might be stuff that you think is really important that educated people know this. Likewise, at the end of primary, you might feel like there's some really important stuff that we did that serves pupils well when they go to secondary school, that we want to make sure we continue to assess. So when we're thinking about let's imagine that we're in year 9 and we want to think about what is really important. So I might go back to my year 7 planning and just pull through some key core questions that I just want to check in with pupils that they've still got understanding around. But there might be other aspects of the year 7 curriculum that was actually wrapped up in the learning they did later on. It was so fundamental to what they did later that actually just testing what they did in year 8 was reliant on that year 7 knowledge. So I don't need explicit separate questions. I can assume that that's covered in there. So it's not a simple process as these lovely even blocks make it look. It's fairly messy, and it does need a bit of time to think about really carefully, and you need to have a really clear sense of what your curriculum goals are to be able to do it effectively. But just to sort of demonstrate how when I did write the assessments for Key Stage 3, I approached it, and just to take sort of the year 7 example, if I look at these questions and think about, okay, what's the really core knowledge that we taught in year 7 that pupils fundamentally need to be successful, that I need to make sure I'm still assessing in year 9? So I could argue, and not everyone would agree with this, but this was the decision making that I went through, that it was core grammar knowledge. So I chose to still have a distinct section on grammar in that year 9 assessment that was directly related to what they'd been taught in year 7. And then thinking about the second question, what is it that's needed short term for later? Well, in year 7, we teach the novel Jekyll and Hyde. I don't need them to remember key quotations from Jekyll and Hyde. It's not the GCSE plot that we text that we do. I don't even necessarily need them to remember all of the intricacies in the plot. Like, what am I doing that novel for? Well, I'm doing it to really support their understanding of genre, to get pupils really familiar with Victorian novels, some of the contextual detail, this kind of the way of writing, the sentence structure that tends to be used, so that they can be exposed to that, and expanding their vocabulary. So I chose not to have a specific section on Jekyll and Hyde, but I did choose to have a section that drew on their understanding of genre and vocabulary that would have been introduced to them in Year 7 and revisited through the tests throughout the years. Because once I kind of thought about my Year 9 test, I can work backwards from there. And then what knowledge do I think is really important for later in life? Well, the other thing we do in Year 7 is, amongst other things, but Greek myths. And I would argue that's really useful knowledge because they're so commonly alluded to in literature. And it's really good for them to have that kind of fingertip knowledge of those myths, so that they haven't got to go away and look up what something means and interrupt and maybe overload them. I want it to be really easily accessible knowledge to them. So I think it's worth me including some knowledge tests in there on what can they remember about Greek myths that will be useful to them. So that was kind of just to illustrate sort of that mapping out process, starting with Year 9 and then working backwards, was how I sort of approached that job with colleagues of working out what the Year 9 assessment would look like. And it can be a really useful way of checking yourself and making sure you're drawing on that full domain rather than just sampling from the recently taught content. So I've taken some points here from a book by Daisy Christodoulou around the features of summative assessment, or the features that make summative assessment more effective. So firstly, it should be taken infrequently, in standard conditions, so pupils taking it in similar conditions. So, you know, obviously, if you're trying to make inferences about what pupils know and what they can do, and one pupil has sat the test at home with all of their materials around them to refer to, the internet to Google the answer on, it's not going to give you an inference that you can compare with the pupil that sat it in silence in a classroom on their own in timed conditions. So those standard conditions are there to enable you to be able to compare performance. It should sample from a much larger domain. So we're thinking about the big picture and just picking out some samples that we can make inferences. And the point of summative assessment is to give us a shared understanding of progress. So if a pupil is has remembered 50% of everything that they were taught, that's a shared understanding that we can then share with families, with parents, and with pupils to give them a sense of how are they progressing through that curriculum. And that's this idea of the curriculum is the progression model. How much of what they've been taught do they know, or how much of what they've been taught to do can they do? And it enables us to distinguish between pupils. And when we get to summative assessments that are like the terminal assessments that pupils sit at the end of their time with us, obviously it's doing all of these things. So we know that those assessments are sat in standard conditions. They'll sample from a domain, which is why it's like, oh, that thing we knew really well didn't come up on the final exam, but you know, the thing that we didn't expect did. It creates that shared understanding. Those grades are turned into some language, which is then shared. So if we talk about like GCSE grades, it's to create that shared understanding and enables then us to distinguish between pupils. That's kind of the point of what they're there for. In terms of in school, it's a good idea not to do summative assessment or summative style assessments more than twice a year. And we'll talk why a little bit later when we think about formative assessment. So I'm not going to say too much about that now. I just want to give you a moment to have a reflect here. So I'm going to give you some time to have a look in your booklet. You've got a space to make some notes, and then I'll pop you in about a minute and a half into breakout rooms so that you can discuss with others. But just to give you a chance to think, for your current assessment model and the summative assessments that you do throughout school, How successfully do you think they sample from the full domain, so from everything that it is you're aiming to teach pupils? And do they check that pupils have retained knowledge in the long term as well as what they've just been taught? So I'll give you a few seconds now whilst I open the groups, and then you can discuss with some of your peers in the breakout rooms. Okay, folks, I'll open the rooms now. I changed the settings. I didn't realise that I didn't have it up so that you could see the breakout rooms. So hopefully you should be able to, at the bottom of the Zoom, see the room available to you. I've changed the titles a little just because we don't have people attending every week from all the subjects. So you'll be across a broader range of subjects. So pick the room most appropriate to you that you think would be most useful to you.
I don't think we can see them, Sally, us BFS people.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. So it would be really great to just get a little bit of feedback about from a couple of you about where you're at with this. I wondered, Ian, would you be able to just share kind of what was discussed in your breakout room and any thoughts that you may have had personally too, if you like?
Yeah, certainly. We were talking. We sort of didn't really get. I was talking from we're talking from a science point of view. We didn't really get past primary science, and that assessment in primary outside of sort of English and maths is nearly all formative. There's very, very little summative assessment, and what assessment there is tends to be on more on very recent learning. We don't go back very far. Very often outside of the core subjects.
Is it something that is worthwhile for primaries to pursue? Like, do you see that as a lack, or do you think that that's a good model? Like,
no, I was sitting here thinking, why haven't I thought of that before?
I don't think it's unusual. I think it's, yeah, I think that there's a primacy that, you know, that maths and English take at primary, which means that sometimes other aspects of the curriculum naturally get quite crowded out, don't they?
Yeah, I was sort of rabbiting on a bit really, but I remember I read I can't remember if this year or last year. I read something about the primary science sample test. They do every couple of years. They do a sort of SATs for science, which is, I think it's like 10,000 children. It hasn't been for a little while because of the pandemic, but the number of children that were sort of working at for science at the end of year 6 based on that test, that sample test, was very, very small. I think it was like, it is sort of just under or just over 20%.
Right.
Compared to typically schools probably report, I don't know the figure I'm afraid, but probably typically report sort of 60-70% working at. And that's possibly largely because that test is based on all Key Stage 2 learning. Whereas we're assessing individually at the end of each unit. So we're only assessing on what they've just been taught all the time.
Yeah, and I think
can't be right.
Although we could look as well at use of formative assessment as well. You know, you can still use your formative assessment, but I guess you can still do retrieval and monitor that to kind of understand how much they remember too, maybe.
Yes, yeah. I wrote that down in my reflection. That you know, we are doing regularly. I think we have sort of a pattern. We're developing a pattern for retrieval practice, retrieval questions at the beginning of each lesson, to make sure we go back and cover everything. Well, not everything. We go back in a sort of systematic way to make sure we're reliably covering what's previously been taught.
Sure.
That's more formative than summative. That's everything.
Okay, thank you. That's useful. And Sam, anything from your group that you kind of discussed that you'd be happy to share?
Well, I was saying that having sort of re-looked at our exams recently, because we're coming to the end of our carousel with one group, so we're having to do our end of year assessments already. I feel that we already do this quite well, and we already sort of check the knowledge. And with music, it is all about the constantly checking that they've retrieved and they are retaining that knowledge, to aid with practical as well. We do both a practical and a written assessment as well.
Great. Okay, fab. Thank you. So I'm going to bring the screen back up now. So hopefully you can see the screen again. And we're going to think a little bit more about actually moving on kind of from what you're assessing to designing your assessment too. So once you've thought about what it is you want to assess, you can start to think about what's the best form of assessment, particularly for your subject area. And what we tend to have is a choice of a quality or a difficulty model of assessment. So the quality model involves a student performing a task for a marker to judge. So examples could be asking a pupil to write a story, write an essay, or actually to do a performance of something. So to produce something which then gets judged and assigned some sort of mark. The difficulty model is where students ask a series of questions of increasing difficulty. So there's kind of like a drop-off point. And an example of that would be how the maths GCSE paper works. So you've got some really difficult decisions to make depending on your subject area as to what model works best for you. And sometimes the model that you go for at Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 2 or further down doesn't have to mirror the summative assessment that they will do at the end of their time with you. So there are different ways to assess. It doesn't just have to be another version of that, like let's say a GCSE paper. So when thinking about how we want to assess, we've got a few decisions to make. So I'm just going to use an example for now of imagining like a drama teacher wants to measure their pupils' acting ability. So let's imagine that this drama teacher has thought really carefully about reliability, and they really want to get rid of any kind of inconsistent marking across the department. So they decide that they're going to give the students a series of multiple choice questions based on a unit about the theatre. And this unit introduces pupils to the basics of theatre and dramatic technique. And as I said, she's chosen those questions because she knows they're really reliable. She knows that if she marks them, or if she asks the other teacher in the department to mark them, the students will get the same mark because there's a right answer that those pupils will pick. She can compare them to last year's students and think about, have we taught this better this year because the students have got a higher mark, or is it just a different cohort? But unfortunately, her choice, you could argue, has low validity, because I think it's clear that a pupil could get 100% on those multiple choice questions, but still be a terrible actor, which was the thing that she was trying to assess. So she might have to revise her decision, and she might have to decide, okay, I'm going to have to do a 20-minute group performance. And now she might be much happier because she feels as if she's actually judging students acting, and that she'll be able to judge their acting based on seeing them act. But now she's got the other problem, is that she's moved into the area of having a highly valid form of assessment. If you want to know if people can act, judge them acting, but it's really low in reliability, because the chance of two different teachers giving students exactly the same mark is really unlikely, because making judgments like that are really difficult. Because the way that we try to do it is we try to come up with, when we're making qualitative judgments about pupil performance, we come up with a rubric, we come up with statements that identify for us what good performance look like. This rubric is taken from a GCSE PE mark scheme. And if you look at it, like, it's really apparent quite quickly what kind of problems that we have. And I know that, like, the English teachers and humanities teachers and probably music can all kind of see something similar in their rubrics. Like, how do teachers in different schools know what something like excellent understanding looks like as compared to good level of understanding? Like, what's the difference between good and excellent? So how am I supposed to know which band to put those pupils in? And there's quite a big mark difference. If I kind of think they're just scraping good understanding and good range, and I give them 13, as opposed to another teacher who looks at it and goes, yeah, this is all excellent, I'm going to give them 20. That's a massive difference. And that's just one aspect. That's just one question from that exam rubric. So it's a really, really difficult job. And we're going to think as well now about some choices that we make and different things that influence our choices, even as ourselves. So we've talked about different markers. Even as an individual, you have your qualitative judgments are very subjective, and we're just going to do a bit of an experiment to help us see this. So I'm going to give you some actions, and I want you to give them, I want you to think about what you would give each action out of 5 to indicate how immoral it is. So if you think, well, that's not that bad, I'll give it a 1. If you think, God, that's evil, that's awful, give it a 5. So just in your head, kind of think what you would give to each of these actions. And just thinking about your decision for poisoning a barking dog, can you type in the chat how immoral you think that is? So 1 is not that immoral. 5 is that's really wrong. Okay, fab. I can see lots of people typing in 5. So we're kind of rating that 4 or 5. Quite evil then. Okay, right. I'm going to ask you to do the same thing again, basically, with a slightly different list. So again, how immoral is each of these actions? Mark out of 5 for each of those. And now I'd like you to type in your answer for how immoral poisoning a barking dog is. So we've seen a bit of slippage. I probably should have just got you to do 1, 2, 3 and told you you could use each number once, but like, we can see that in the first example, when we are comparing the barking dog to things that don't physically harm a living thing, people tend to think poisoning a barking dog is like really awful. But then when we give them a different set of parameters, and when we're talking about killing people and people who did nothing to deserve it, so although poisoning a barking dog is pretty dreadful, the dog was at least barking, so did maybe give us a motive, as opposed to a completely motiveless murder or using guns on people who are peacefully protesting. And this is exactly what can happen to us when we have different cohorts as well. So if you're working with a particularly weak cohort, for example, your judgment about what's very good or excellent is completely skewed because you're looking at the top end of what is generally a weak cohort. Whereas if you were working with a really, really high attaining cohort, actually, you're very likely to, the people at the bottom of that cohort, underestimate what they can do. And therefore, you know, this was clearly one of the problems with teacher assessed grades over the last couple of years, because we didn't have that kind of national comparison or standardization process in place. It was a case of thinking about your own cohort, and that was a very limited knowledge base to draw on, added to the fact as well that we were all like asking different questions and using different parameters. So the whole thing just meant that that shared meaning and that consistency of standard wasn't there. So what can we do to improve the accuracy of our inferences? What actions do we take when we're dealing with a situation like this? We've got a rubric. What is it that we actually do to try and be a little bit more reliable around the inferences we make? Just type in the chat actions that teachers take to prevent the teacher in classroom A giving a pupil a 13 and the pupil teacher next door giving them a 20. What do we kind of all do to stop that from happening? Great, yeah. Perfect. Yeah, moderation. Shared mark schemes, yeah, although with the shared mark schemes, you might like exemplification of that. Exemplars, yeah, okay, good. So sort of the two things generally used, like standardization, where you say, this is an example of a band 4 answer, and exemplify where it meets the mark scheme. And then, so that's kind of at the beginning of the marking process. Then everyone does their marking, and then you can do moderation afterwards where you can compare. And that's kind of how you can work to reduce that. You can also balance out that difficulty model, which is prone to this kind of qualitative subjective decision making, with some closed questions. So you can think about maybe taking a balance from both aspects. So if I go back a few slides, like maybe the drama teacher, actually very similar to what Sam said, might go for a little bit of a balance if they're going to do a few multiple choice questions within their assessment, and they're also going to do an evaluation of a short performance. So you can think about whether you can balance those in your assessment model as well to help you get around some of these issues. So just to kind of sum up what we've covered so far, because there's quite a lot that we've covered. We're teaching a whole subject, we're teaching a whole domain, and the assessment is just of a sample, but we have to be really careful about the sample and the way that we assess that sample to try and make valid inferences. We want our inferences, we want our assessments to be reliable, so we need to think about the quality and the difficulty models and how we can balance that so that we can get the balance right between a valid assessment and also a reliable assessment. And also, by thinking of the whole curriculum and the progression through the curriculum, we can try to make a meaningful system and a shared understanding, but that can be really difficult because it can be really hard for people to know, what does 60% in music mean? Is it comparable to 60% in art? And those are the other difficulties that we face as well. So they could all be supported by effective communication and by us understanding why we've made the decisions we've made, but they're just things that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to move on now to formative assessment. Just to give you a heads up, I think it is likely that tonight will be the full time, but I appreciate if people need to leave a little earlier, that's fine. It will all be recorded, even if it's just sad old me talking to myself. And I'll share it with you afterwards if you can't stay until 5:30. Okay, so again, using the chat, what comes to mind when I talk about formative assessment? Just first thing that comes into your head, stick it in the chat and let's see what we come up with. So we've talked about summative, what we're talking about formative. Okay, questioning, use of mini whiteboards. God, my chat's really annoying, it keeps jumping up. over shoulder marking, so looking at pupils' work as they go, lots of quizzing, mini questioning throughout the lesson. Naomi needing to know what misunderstanding students have within a lesson, yeah. So assessment during a lesson topic, questioning, quiz exposed, and low stakes really important so that pupils are able to make mistakes, because it's really important you know what those mistakes are. Exit tickets, all that kind of, okay, great ideas there. So I think sometimes like it's really easy to think of the activities that we want to use. And actually the key thing around formative assessment is that we're measuring something different. Thanks, Andrew. I'll make sure I send the recording through afterwards. So a lot of you there kind of picking up on some of the activities, but also getting to like the heart of what that assessment is. It's about assessment for learning. I'll just let you read what's on this slide, and then we'll look at why. So it's not uncommon in a secondary school to kind of say, okay, this is the target for a pupil. So let's say their target grade is a grade 5. That's what performance at grade 5 looks like. And then we're going to measure their progress towards that from as far back as year 7. Are they progressing kind of from grade 2, 3, 4, 5? Similarly, in primary, although the language is different, it's not uncommon to kind of say this is the end performance of a child reaching expected, and then track their progress across and kind of using, are they working towards, are they at expected, or are they exceeding? And one of the questions that at my children's last school, whenever we had assessment data, and I was always told, like, at the beginning of the year, they're working at expected. Are they working at expected for what you would expect for them now, or are they working at expected for the end of the year, or are they working for expected at the end of the key stage? And nobody could ever give me a straight answer. And so this kind of desire to create this shared understanding, but actually I wasn't really learning anything useful, but I'm conscious that they had assessment systems that probably took an awful lot of time to be able to try to give me something useful. So you can kind of see here Dylan William arguing that this is a bit of a fallacy, and we'll have a look at why that is. So let's say that we've got 4 children. So let's say they've just done their year 6 SATs, and we've got child A working towards, sorry, that should say child B and child C. So child B and child C are both working at expected, and child D is exceeding expected standard. So these judgments have been made about the level they're working at. I mean, we say year 6, but I mean, you could relate this to key stage 1 or key stage 3, or you could change it to grades that would kind of be around average or above average. But the first thing to say about that is these children are not necessarily working at this standard all the time. They performed at that standard in a snapshot in time when they sat that summative assessment. So if you remember our work on reliability, they might not have performed at that standard on a different way. Now, if they're bang in the middle of a broad range, you probably would say they would still fall within that range. But for the children at the peripheries, there's a strong chance that they might have fallen either side of that periphery, depending on the day. Or if they'd sat a test drawn from different parts of the domain, for example, or if they'd had a different marker. Secondly, you wouldn't have generated these decisions without some sort of either a standardized score or a grade boundary, and that meant there was a cutoff point. So there was somebody one side of a boundary, and if they'd have got a mark more, they would have fallen the other side of the boundary, and they would have had a different label given to them. Now there has to be boundaries, like that's a part of life, isn't it? Like it's like frustrating as anything if you're the pupil that's the wrong side of that boundary and it's your GCSE results, and but there does have to be that cut-off somewhere. But for our purposes, in terms of teaching pupils what they need to know, that's really problematic, isn't it? Because we are putting children into different groups when they've just fallen one side of a boundary that might not have been a secure boundary for them. So in this model, if we're kind of saying pupil A is working towards, then we might put those pupils into completely different sets. So we might say child A is going to go, they're working towards, they need to be kind of in a set 4 when they go to secondary school. Child B, we're going to put them into set 3. And, you know, we've got child D who's going to go into top set, and we're going to treat those children differently. We're going to have different expectations of them. We might generate completely different target grades for them. In our heads, we might think of them as needing very different things. But if I showed you their data on a bell curve, you might notice something fairly significant. In that, child A and child B, who have got completely different labels, have way more in common than child B and child C, who've got the same label. So child B and child C are miles apart on the band that puts them into the expected standard. But I'm treating child B differently from child A, even though they're right next to each other. And likewise, child C and child D could be right next to each other, but they just fell the other side of that boundary, that cutoff. And No More Marking, looking at writing analysis, have identified that in the year 6 SATs, for example, there's about a 3-year difference between pupils at the two far ends. So that's a 3-year gap. So realistically, this gap between pupil B and C, who we're putting at the same level, could be 18 months. So it could be a massive gap between them, but they've got the same label, and we might set them off on the same trajectory as a result of that. So going back to this idea, that's kind of why those labels aren't particularly helpful to us in terms of how we want to teach pupils, and thinking of that end performance and trying to track towards that isn't necessarily giving us the information that we need in order to benefit pupils as much as possible. It also assumes that progress is linear. So what do we do when we sample from a part of the domain that's more challenging? If we're formatively assessing what we've just taught and we know it's really difficult and pupils find it really hard, well, does that mean that they've gone backwards because they maybe didn't reach expected on this part? So we need to really think about that as well. And the other thing is what we talked about earlier, like the pressure to demonstrate progress, to prove we're good teachers, we're doing what we need to do. That's really strong. That's a real strong pressure, especially if it's tied into performance management. And it means that when we're generating internal data, we are likely to assess in a way that demonstrates progress rather than exposing weaknesses. And actually what we want to do is expose pupils' weaknesses in learning. If we don't know what the weaknesses are, we don't have the power to intervene, and we cannot teach responsibly. So in a system like this, you may well have teachers and students having some kind of shared understanding of a label for a piece of work or a grade for a piece of work, but not necessarily the information that you need to actually help pupils learn. And what can be really challenging is when we try to conflate summative assessments with formative assessments. So using the style of questions that pupils get in a summative assessment, like an end of key stage or a GCSE assessment, tracking that back and using those to assess pupils against that end standard can make feedback on performance very, very difficult, as we'll see moving forwards. So assessment for learning. The point of assessment for learning is to reveal a weakness in students' learning. It's not just different strategies, it's not just different timing, it's a whole different thinking about assessment. We're not trying to show what they can do so much as we're trying to expose what they can't do so that we can do something about it. So I want you to think about what you might do if you were training to run a marathon. Can you just put in the chat some of the things that you might do? Like, let's say you decide to run a marathon next year, what are you going to start doing from next week to get ready for that? And just put those ideas in the chat. Building up running distances over sustained periods of time. So we might start with short running distances and build up our endurance over time. Healthy eating, planning, increasing the length of the run, following a plan. So very similar things, running longer distances over time. Great, all good ideas, lovely. So I'm really glad that nobody said I'm just going to run lots of marathons, like, because a really bad thing to do if you want to run a marathon is to just go out and start running. I'm going to run a marathon every week and I'm going to get really good at running marathons. But very often this is kind of how we can approach assessment in school. So if we're going to assess pupils by an extended piece of writing, we tend to formatively assess them by asking them to do extended pieces of writing. And that makes it very difficult for us to then give them helpful feedback. So if you were running a marathon, absolutely, you're spot on. You might go out for your regular runs and you might increase your distances. You might try running on different terrains. So there's a good book by Murakami about, it's called something like What I Think About When I Think About Running. And he was training for, I think, the New York Marathon, which has loads of bridges in it. So his training needed to involve lots of hill running so that he built up his stamina, so that in those kind of final bridges before the finish line, he had plenty of stamina left. One of the things that I've discovered from attempting to run in my advanced years that was a really bad idea was, like, you need to have really good core strength. So you might decide you're going to go to some Pilates classes in order to build up your core strength, or just generally to engage in some strength training, which can really impact on your ability to prevent injury. You might think about kind of sprint sessions so that you can work on your speed. So there are lots of different aspects, but what you wouldn't do is just run loads of marathons. But sometimes, because we assess pupils in this way, we get them to kind of do that final performance, and we try to think about what's their progress towards that final desired improvement. We can find it really difficult to isolate what aspect it is that we need to work on. So I found out that I ran too far too quickly and, like, got really badly injured, and then needed a whole program of physiotherapy to address that. That needed to be very specific for me. Whereas actually, if I'd known where I had particular weaknesses before I started running long distances, I could have thought about those things and planned for them in advance and done those exercises to prepare me better. And these comments, these are genuine comments that I have kind of collated, not from our schools, but from, like, where I've seen examples on work on the internet of how difficult it is to provide helpful feedback for pupils when we're trying to use summative assessments formatively. So I look at these and it seems obvious to me that somebody is really struggling to isolate what exactly is it that these pupils need to do to make their work better. So they're kind of grasping at straws a little bit, like, make it look nicer, or practice your spelling and punctuation. Well, that's a little bit specific, but what spellings? Like, just generally, where do I start with that if I'm a pupil? So when you've got kind of a generic marking policy and you're trying to kind of generate generic statements, that feedback can become useful, and teachers are spending hours and hours and hours writing feedback to pupils that is essentially useless. And even when it's more focused on subject-specific curricular goals, it doesn't make it more helpful. So let's look at some here that are based on curricular goals. Make your analysis more sophisticated. Like, so now I've been told that, am I going to be able to do it? Probably not. Take care with accuracy. Like, again, if I could do that, I probably would have done it in the first place. So just because we tell a pupil what to do and it's linked to the mark scheme doesn't necessarily mean that they can do it. So overusing summative assessment is a bit like running too many marathons, because it means that hours of class time goes into pupils producing work that teachers then spend hours reading and trying to think of helpful ways of feeding back. And all of that work is crowding out the much more useful work you could do. The short distances, the building up stamina, the core work that might help pupils. It doesn't look anything like running a marathon, but it's more helpful in getting them to run a marathon than by asking them to do loads of marathon runs. And that's really important, is that summative assessment and formative assessment don't have to look the same. They might look really, really different. I'll let you read this for a moment. So the activities that we want pupils to master are the things that we want to formatively assess that they can do. And those are taking those complex tasks, the summative assessment, the composite that you're aiming for, breaking it down into small, precise units, practiced it until it's fluent. And those are things that you can then give much more helpful feedback in. And this is where deliberate practice comes in. So deliberate practice is those small units that are very structured, they have a very clear end goal, which is to overall improve performance. And then you design the specific tasks that might help somebody overcome problems with performance. So I know nothing about football, so I'm going to look really ignorant now, but like in terms of practicing penalties, but the real specifics about the position of the foot against the ball, where the eye line goes, the kind of the speed and the angle of the run up. These are all very specific things that can be adjusted in order to improve that performance. A bit like how core stability training or dynamic stretching might improve the performance of runners, but it doesn't look anything like the end result. And then the feedback that you can give pupils can be about those specific things, and you're thinking about, did that work? Did that work? Were they able to do that? So kind of Daisy Christodoulou summarises the difference between formative and summative assessment in this way, which I'll just let you read. And she suggests making no attempt whatsoever to try to generate marks or grades or ideas of standards around your formative assessment, because you can't, because it's such a tiny part of the domain that it doesn't mean anything in terms of the big part. It's just the tiny components that you're assessing. Can they do it or can't they? 1 or 0. And then your 1s are the things your pupils are secure, and your 0s are the things they need to work at. So this is like the challenge of responsive teaching. And we're really thinking about what are the drills and the tasks that we need pupils to master. These are the composites. No, they're not. That's wrong. They're the components. I always do this. I always say composites. So the composite is the big picture, the components are the little bits. So the bits that you want them to drill and the mini tasks are the components, and you provide repeated opportunities for this, and you monitor, you respond to pupil success and failure, and you adapt your teaching accordingly. And that sounds like a big deal thing, but it's really not. Like, teachers do this instinctively. You notice a pupil's frowning and you think, maybe I need to explain that a bit more clearly. You go around the classroom and you see someone stuck. You ask them what they're going to do next. Like, I don't mean like big picture, like I'm going to put a massive intervention in place. I just mean we read the room all the time. We think about how it seems to be going down, and we adapt, we re-explain, we go over things again. We maybe do a little one-to-one explanation as needed. That's just part of what you do, and that's responsive teaching. But if you're thinking really carefully about the performance that you're aiming for and those component parts of it, that reaction will be really helpful to pupils. And it means you can get the balance right between teaching and assessing, because we don't want to be assessing so much that we never teach anything new at all. And what I would say is that meeting with other subject leaders or with your team at secondary are your opportunity to think really deeply about what are your responses to weaknesses in pupil learning. So what are those walks around the classroom telling you people struggle with, or when you look over their shoulder at the work, or when you're explaining and they seem to not be getting it? What are the things that they really struggle with, and what collectively are your ideas about working forward and dealing with that? So a moment for you to reflect here. We won't do a breakout room afterwards just because of time, but I'll just give you a moment in your workbooks to jot down whether you've got responses to any of these questions that you need to think about moving forward with your assessment practice. So just before we finish off, I've got a little bit about the reading between now and next week, but before that, we're just going to do a little bit on multiple choice questions. And I've got a bit of a quiz for you. So once again, if you could put your answer in the chat, number 1 to 4, whichever answer you think is correct. What is the capital city of the Marshall Islands? So 1 to 4 in the chat for whichever one you believe to be correct, please. I'm not going to give you ages, so you're going to have to make a quick choice. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so we've got some 2s, we've got some 3s. I forgot to tell you not to Google it, by the way, so. Okay, let's try again. Have a look again and tell me what you think the capital city of the Marshall Islands is. Okay, cool. Now, really annoyingly, quite a lot of you got the answer right the first time. Although, interestingly, not the first person. And it's interesting that everyone didn't copy the first person. People guessed. Great. Did we guess the second time? Less likely. No. So why would you know the answer this time? Julie, why were you, I mean, I think you got it right both times, but why might you be more confident the second time?
I literally guessed the first one, and the second time because I know the other 3.
Okay, fine, thank you. So so when you're writing multiple choice questions, your correct answer is the answer, and then your other possible answers are your distractors. So what you want to do is to make sure if you are using multiple choice questions, some people just think they're too easy, and I think that's because we see too many on like TV programs where they're designed to get everyone to ring in so they can make millions of pounds out of us because the answer's so obvious. Here the answer is really obvious because you can know nothing about the Marshall Islands and be able to guess that answer by process of elimination. If your distractors are plausible distractors, so if the words are words that are, you know, these are words, other capitals that were probably unlikely to be familiar to you, you're much more likely to have needed to know the answer than to be able to guess accurately, although obviously you have got a 1 in 4 chance. Naomi looks like she's saying something clever in the chat, so. Okay,
that might be something to come back to, but it was just something I was thinking about.
Cool. So that's kind of what we can think about when we're using multiple choice questions. If you are using them, think really carefully about making it more difficult by ensuring that your distractors are really plausible. And likewise, you can have more than one correct answer. And that means that pupils really need to think. If you say to them, like, which of these sentences are complete, which of these is complete sentences, sorry about the typo there, but all 4 of them could be to the pupil. So they've got to read every single one and they've got to think really carefully about it. And then you can also deliberately put answers in there that will expose a misconception. So here, we ate is a complete sentence, but pupils tend to say it isn't because they actually judge a sentence on how long it is, and they have this misconception that something short can't be a sentence. So you can put in those deliberate questions to identify misconceptions, and you can make it more difficult by having multiple correct answers as well. So kind of key messages from this part, we've talked about these. Really trying to distinguish and decouple formative assessment and summative assessment. And then keeping a record of those pupil weaknesses. So sometimes you can respond in the moment. Other times, actually, you might feel like, do you know what, they're really struggling with this, and I haven't at the tip of my tongue got the perfect way to explain it. So we will move on now. I will go back to my colleagues, or I will go away and think about it, and I will plan a better way to come to respond to that misconception that they've got, so that I can make sure that we really deal with this effectively. If you are totally fascinated by assessment theory, these books are on page 6 of your booklet. So they go into much more detail about some of the things I've tried to cover this evening. And then finally, for next week, just to build on this, there's a link in your workbook to this blog. And when you open it, if you scroll down, you'll see there's a subheading, The Battle of the Bridge. So you can read all of it if you want, but the bit that I'd like you to focus on is from there, because it's specific to what we've been talking about. And then the reflection questions here are in your booklet too, and you can think about your action plan. So I'm going to stop there because it's 5:30. Everything's in your booklet ready. And then next week we'll be coming back. We can have a bit of feedback from this, and then it'll be the final week, and we'll be looking at quality assurance. So how you can assure yourself that the curriculum is being delivered and having the impact you want on pupils. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hang around for a couple of seconds if anyone's got questions.